Hello, young scholars. This is Mr. Barter coming to you with part 3 of our lecture, our discussion on federalism. And in this video, we're going to talk about the different types of federalism. We're going to talk about dual federalism, cooperative federalism, and fiscal federalism. All about the money in this video. All right, so what is dual federalism? Well, as you guys can imagine, dual federalism is a system of government where both the state and national government remain supreme within their own spheres, and each has a responsibility for some policies. Think of it like a layered cake. And this is an example that AP government students love because all the references to federalism are like cakes. So dual federalism, like a layer cake, like a, dare I say, a wedding cake. It has different layers. So you've got the bottom layer, which is the biggest, which would be the federal government. And then that is supported by the next layer above it, which is a little bit smaller, and that would be the state governments, and then the county governments, and then the municipal governments, and then the tippy top, or the bottom, the smallest part of the cake, would be the local governments. But it's important to understand, each in a dual federalist system, the layer cake model, each cake has their own set of responsibilities. So, for example, that base layer of the cake, that bottom layer, that could be chocolate. The one above it could be vanilla. The one above it could be strawberry. And you could take a piece from each, and each have a different flavor. They each have their own set of responsibilities. So the other interesting element of dual federalism is that power is narrowly interpreted. All right, the federal government powers are narrowly interpreted. This ends in the 1930s. Why does it end in the 1930s? Well, if you guessed dual federalism ends in the 1930s because of the Great Depression, you're correct, because it is with the election of Franklin Roosevelt and the incorporation of governmental powers and the expansion of the size and scope of the federal government. You're exactly right. That will give rise to our next type of federalism, which is called cooperative federalism. And this is a system of government where powers and policy assignments are shared between the states and the national government. For example, Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare coming from the federal government, Medicaid coming from the state government. These are all responsibilities where the state and the federal government are sort of blended, or like a marble cake. So think of it like this. When you're looking at a marble cake or marble or like a chocolate swirl, you can see the flavors are almost blended. So in this instance, federal power and state power gets blended. A really great example is the Ocean City Bridge, the 9th Street Bridge from Summers Point into Atlantic City. Who polices that roadway? The Ocean City Police do. Who built that road? Well, Ocean City didn't. Summers Point didn't. That's not a county road. That was built with federal dollars. And as a matter of fact, the original 9th Street Bridge, before the expansion a couple years ago, the original 9th Street Bridge was built during the Great Depression by the WPA. That was a New Deal project, and it was expanded under the American in the 2000s or the mid 2000s a couple years ago. That bridge was expanded under the American Recovery Act signed by President Obama. So you see this idea that the federal government can provide money for the states and the states can provide assistance to the people. So marble cake federalism is this idea of cooperative federalism. Okay, and again, like I just said, this means shared costs and shared administration of projects. The other element of cooperative federalism is this. The federal government will give the states grants or funding for certain projects. Again, using the example of the 9th Street Bridge, the federal government can earmark money for a project in Atlantic County. And with that money, the state of New Jersey will hire a contractor to weld the steel together. And since that contractor is getting paid with federal dollars, that contractor must adhere to federal laws and regulations. So that means affirmative action. That means federal safety requirements. So if there is non-compliance with this company, that becomes a federal issue, not a state issue. So it's important to understand it's all about who's getting the money and who gets what and where and how, the question of politics. So then we have our next concept is called fiscal federalism. And fiscal federalism is the pattern of spending, taxing, and providing grants in the federal system. This is so important, okay? The idea of the federal grant system. The cornerstone of the national government's relationships with the state and local governments is fiscal federalism. Just to show you, and I'll come back to that slide in just a second, just to show you how much money the federal government spends fiscally in grants to federal and local governments. It has been increasing each year. Because what we're noticing is that as communities and states need more assistance, they don't want to put that burden on the taxpayer. So what do? They apply for grants or some sort of help from the federal government. For example, a couple years ago, the Egg Harbor Township Police Department had a grant from the federal government that was for a couple $1 million, which was for a couple of police officers, and that was a part of a federal grant program. Another example, several years ago when I first started teaching, we had what are called SROs, or school resource officers. That was part of a grant program to Egg Harbor Township. That grant has since expired. That money has run out, and the program was not renewed, and therefore we don't have the school resource officers anymore. Okay, that everyone thinks that was just a police officer assigned to the school, which in theory it was, but it was part of a grant package. Okay. And as this figure shows, and you guys can see quite obviously, is that as the federal government power increases, so does fiscal grant writing and grant spending. And that's another way for the federal government to maintain its power. And that's by issuing grants. Right. Some additional federal or fiscal federalism, and if you need more room, you can put this in where it says understanding the pie, the money. Okay, there's something called categorical grants. And again, these grant systems we're going to explain, we're going to go over in a little bit more detail in class, but they're so important. So a categorical grant is a federal grant that has to be used for specific purposes. I like to call it a grant with strings attached. So, for example, the federal government can give the state of New Jersey a grant for, I don't know, let's say $30 million, but that $30 million has to be used for school safety, and in particular, improving the locks on school doors or making sure that all the doors lock. Okay, that's important. That's what's called a categorical grant. They're project-based, based on merit, meaning schools and people have to apply. And if someone asks me in class, I will show you one of these pages where you can apply for these grants. And these grants, again, it's a very intense process to apply for these grants. And then there's also formula-based where there's a formula that the federal government uses in order to maximize its influence and do the most good with the least amount of money using these grants. Then in comparison, there's something called a block grant. And a block grant it's a block of cash or money that's given to the state from the federal government that is for a broader purpose. There are no strings attached to a block grant. So think about it like this. Who would prefer a block grant, and what type of person would prefer a categorical grant? So you have to ask yourself, which person or which group of people, which political party would the federal government have more power over with using the grant system? So Democrats are more in support of categorical grants because this means the federal government gets to dictate exactly what money is being spent and for how much, the strings that are attached. Block grants would be more of a favorite position used by conservatives because, again, it's the federal government saying, okay, here's a block of money. I'm going to give it to the states. States, you use the money as you see fit. Now, again, that's a very simplified version of what a block grant is. Typically, let's say if it's, but again, using the idea of school safety, the federal government gives a block grant to the state of New Jersey, says, all right, here is $30 billion. Spend it as you want. Our only criteria is it has to be something to enhance school safety and school security. Where a categorical grant may say, okay, here's $30 million, but you need to spend it on schools with a high with a Title I school districts, or you have to spend it on inner city school districts, or some other string that is attached. So again, make sure you understand the difference between categorical grants and block grants. All right, and just the final point is that grants are given to state and local governments. Okay, so fiscal federalism continued, and again, this goes into understanding the pie. Scramble for federal dollars. All right. The federal budget, and again, we'll get to this in a couple future chapters. The federal budget process is so competitive. It is, there's only X amount of dollars in the federal budget, and, we just can't keep raising taxes. So who gets what money is incredibly important. Roughly about $460 billion is spent in grants. Grant distribution follows universal system, so they try and put a little something for everyone. All right, and then we have something called what are mandates, and a mandate is a directive from state or local governments to comply with federal rules or threat of penalties. Again, and this is kind of the example I used with the construction project. If we're gonna if my construction company is receiving a grant or is being employed because of a grant, we have to comply with the federal government with what's called a mandate. The problem is sometimes there are so many rules and regulations, it actually is more beneficial for companies not to bid or participate in the contract. And that's, again, one of the fundamental differences between Democrats and Republicans, not just as in the size and scope of the federal government, but also, how much authority the government should have over these projects. Some people would even call this, micromanaging. We want to give you, here's $10 million, go fix this project. Go fix this problem. It doesn't need to necessarily be politically correct in how it's executed. But then there's some that are saying, listen, this money's coming from the federal government. It's coming from taxpayer dollars. It needs to be executed. The laws need to be executed faithfully and fairly. And then we have unfunded mandates. And this is such an important term. Now, an unfunded mandate is when the federal government sets a rule, policy, or procedure and tells the states and agencies that they have to comply without giving the appropriate money for fulfilling that requirement. So an example would be, we were talking in terms of education, an unfunded mandate would be a program that says, okay, schools around the country have to hit a certain percentage on a national proficiency. Students have to hit a certain score on a national proficiency test. Okay, well, that is now policy that the states have to live up to. But if no money is being given to the states to give to the schools, that becomes an unfunded mandate. It's almost as if I was sitting here saying, okay, I expect all of you, it is now policy that if you're going to graduate from high school, you need to pass AP Government with a 5 on your exam without giving you a book, without giving you any supplies or really any materials to achieve your objective. And that causes a bit of controversy with the mandate system. All right, so I want to go over the advantages and disadvantages of federalism. So we said the advantages for democracy in federalism is that it increases access to government. All right, local problems can be solved locally. All right, we don't have to go to the federal government for an issue with the school board or with our school system. We can go to our school board. All right. And the idea also, federalism also makes it hard for political parties or interest groups to dominate all politics. I mean, think about that. That's something that's pretty unique, especially when we were just debating and discussing the idea of federalism and political parties and the idea of factions. Some people, argue that the country's got too big and there's too many groups, there's too many factions. Well, the idea of federalism makes sure that these factions can compete at different levels and they can participate at different levels within the government. All right. Some of the disadvantages for the democracies is that states have different levels of service. And one of the things when we get to this idea of bureaucracy, it's incredibly complicated. It's incredibly difficult to navigate. And, you're trying to get a ruling from an agency. You may have to cut through several steps. All right, local interests can counteract national interests, and that also is important. So maybe you have, and I think we talked about this in the Federalist debate. Maybe you have an issue that is counter to your local beliefs and policies are counter to what the mood of the nation is. But the United States is setting course and setting policy. And then another, this is more or less a conservative argument, is that there's too many levels of government and too much money. And the problem there becomes the size of the government's too big, too powerful, and because there's so many levels of government, it leads to all sorts of mistrust and miscommunication, and the government ends up not working for the people. All right, so that is, again, just a general overview. I wanted to dispense with all the nitty-gritty, the notes. We have one more video after this where we go over some of the time periods and definitions of federalism. So if you need to watch this video again, please do so. But we're going to talk about federal mandates and federal programs in class, and we're going to explore those topics a little bit more in depth. So if you need to watch this video again, please do so. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please post them or email me.